November 15, 1942, 8:01 ordered hours. The waters south of Savo Island were black as ink. On the bridge of the battleship Kirishima, Captain Sanji Iwabuchi stared into the darkness through the world's finest optical rangefinders. For a decade, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled the night, its gunners trained to see farther, shoot faster, and strike deadlier than any opponent. Yet that night, unseen and unheard, another battleship watched them through invisible eyes. USS Washington tracked every movement not with binoculars or searchlights, but through beams of radial energy no human eye could detect. Its Mark 8 radar whispered range and bearing into the Mark 1A computer, machines that calculated death with mechanical perfection. At 01 centered, Washington's guns thundered. 16-inch shells ripped through darkness and steel alike. Within 7 minutes, Kirishima was burning, helpless, doomed. The Americans had not merely outshot their enemy, they had changed the nature of naval war itself. As fire consumed the sea's surface, one question echoed through history: what happens when technology turns the night itself into an ally? Before that night in November 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it owned the darkness. Its officers had spent decades mastering night combat. Lookouts trained their eyes until they could identify a ship's class by silhouette alone. Gunners drilled relentlessly with optical rangefinders of unmatched precision. And their weapon, the Type 93 Long-Lance Torpedoes, was a silent killer that could strike from 20 miles away, leaving no visible wake. At Savo Island just 3 months earlier, Japanese cruisers had annihilated an Allied force, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in less than an hour of night fighting. To the Japanese, that victory confirmed what years of doctrine had promised. Superior optics and discipline would always triumph in the dark. Across the ocean, the United States had chosen a different path. American naval development did not seek to perfect the old AD. It sought to reinvent warfare itself. While Japanese engineers polished glass lenses, American physicists bent radio waves. In laboratories from Washington, D.C., to Cambridge, scientists discovered that ships could reflect those waves like mirrors. At the Naval Research Laboratory, early experiments hinted that invisible energy might reveal targets beyond the reach of any human eye. By 1940, crude prototypes had been tested aboard the USS New York, directing gunfire not by sight, but by echo. The device was unreliable, bulky, and temperamental, but it worked. Where Japan's doctrine sought perfection before adoption, America embraced imperfection if it meant progress. That difference in philosophy would prove decisive. Admiral Ernest King, soon to become Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, recognized what radar meant. It was not an accessory, it was a revolution. King ordered the integration of radar into every element of naval operations: detection, navigation, fire control, aircraft direction. The task fell to a new institution, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, established in late 1940. Within months, over 4,000 engineers and scientists were working to turn theoretical radiophysics into practical weapons of war. They worked in parallel, shared discoveries instantly, and tested prototypes at sea within weeks. Each success accelerated the next, and by mid-1942, American ships were entering combat with the first Mark 8 fire control radar, connected to Mark 1A analog computers that continuously solved ballistic equations in real time. For the first time in naval history, a ship could fight without seeing its enemy. That new capability arrived in the Pacific with Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee and his battleship USS Washington. Lee was not a typical admiral. An Olympic gold medal marksman, he understood both precision and timing. He had studied radar since its infancy, knew its limitations, and trusted its promise. When he took command of Task Force 64, built around Washington and her sister ship South Dakota, he carried with him a conviction few commanders yet shared: that a machine's judgment could outmatch a man's instincts. By mid-November 1942, Lee's force patrolled the waters off Guadalcanal, ordered to intercept the Japanese task group under Admiral Nobutake Kondo. Error. Text input sequence must be Stir Kondo's flagship, Kirishima, steamed proudly with cruisers and destroyers intent on bombarding American positions ashore. To the Japanese, the plan was sound. They had won every major night surface action so far. They expected another swift victory, another testament to their doctrine. But as night fell over the Solomon Sea, the balance of centuries was about to shift. At 2:17 hours, Washington's SG surface search radar picked up contacts more than 18,000 yards away, far beyond visual detection. Lee ordered his men to hold fire. He waited, calm and deliberate, as his radar operators tracked each enemy course and bearing. Inside the plotting rooms, numbers flowed across mechanical dials. Computers murmured. The Mark 8 radar refined its range solution with every sweep. Every man aboard Washington could feel the tension of unseen pursuit. They heard the Japanese destroyers long before they saw Thamir, but Lee trusted the invisible more than the visible. The Imperial Japanese Navy was still fighting with eyes. Lee was fighting with data. By 0 hours, the range had closed to 8,400 yards. Kondo ships still had no idea they were being tracked. Their doctrine eye, based on sight, had left them blind in a new kind of night. Lee's voice came over the ship's intercom, "Open fire." In that instant, a decade of American scientific labor met the sea. The future had arrived, measured not in explosions but in equations. At precisely 0100 hours, the USS Washington unleashed her first full salvo. 9 16-inch shells, each weighing nearly a ton, roared into the darkness. There were no searchlights, no visual aiming points, only the rhythm of the Mark 8 radar, pulsing data into the Mark 1A fire control computer. The guns obeyed mathematics, not human sight. Across the Black Sea, the battleship Kirishima still had no idea where the blows were coming from. The first hits tore through her superstructure. Observers aboard Washington saw sudden orange flashes bloom across the horizon, followed by the glow of spreading fires. Within seconds, radar returns from Kirishima's outline flickered and fragmented, echo proof that steel was being ripped apart. As more salvos thundered out, the American plotting team watched their analog dials update range and bearing, making microscopic corrections automatically. Every impact tightened the radar solution, every echo refined the computer's aim. It was as if the ship itself was learning. On Kirishima's bridge, Captain Sanji Iwabuchi tried to make sense of the chaos. His optical rangefinders were useless through the smoke and rain. Every few seconds, the ship shuddered as shells smashed through decks and compartments. Without radar, his gunners were blind, firing at muzzle flashes that came and went like ghosts. He believed they had scored hits and his last report would claim as much, but in truth, not a single Japanese shell touched Washington. Within 7 minutes, Kirishima's steering jammed. Her main battery fell silent. Flooding below decks threatened to capsize her, and fire raced up her masts. At 0325 hours, she rolled and slipped beneath the waves, taking 212 men with her. More than 1,000 survivors were rescued, Iwabuchi himself among them. He could not have known that his enemy had never even been seen. The USS Washington fought, killed, and disappeared, draining all without entering visual range. For the men aboard Washington, the engagement felt unreal. Radar operators reported solid locks. Gun crews executed firing orders without ever glimpsing their target. The mechanical computers hummed in the plotting rooms, relaying corrected firing data faster than any human could calculate. Each salvo was a proof of concept for a new kind of warfare. The battle was not a duel between admirals, it was a contest between two civilizations' approaches to technology. The Imperial Japanese Navy, masters of precision optics and night gunnery, had assumed that victory came from discipline and eyesight. For a generation, they had trained to fight the perfect night engagement, quiet, invisible, and deadly. But that perfection had become a prison. Their doctrine relied on seeing, and the night now belonged to those who could fight without sight. In that short, brutal encounter off Guadalcanal, the Japanese learned that seeing no longer meant knowing. For Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, the result confirmed what he already believed. Before the war, he had spent hours in experimental firing exercises, learning to trust radar returns over intuition. He had seen the data match the hits. Now, in combat, that trust paid off. Lee's composure during the battle was legendary. While others might have illuminated the target with searchlights or closed the range for confirmation, he relied entirely on his instruments. He understood that radar wasn't just another sensor. It was a command advantage, a way to perceive the enemy's position, speed, and heading with mechanical certainty. He later told his officers, "If you can see them on radar, you can kill them before they ever see you." That night, radar-directed fire control proved itself as the most decisive innovation of the Pacific War. The combination of the Mark 8 radar and the Mark 1A computer turned a battleship's gunnery into an automated process. As the radar tracked the target, the computer continuously solved ballistic equations, adjusting for ship movement, target motion, and even barrel wear. If a shell fell short, the radar detected the splash and fed the correction back into the system automatically. No human observation, no voice command, no delay. This closed-loop feedback made Washington's fire faster and more accurate than any manual gunnery in history. By contrast, the Japanese relied on what their eyes could interpret. Optical rangefinders demanded line of sight. Rangekeepers depended on manual plotting and guesswork. Even the most skilled crew needed seconds to recalculate after each salvo. In a 7-minute engagement, those seconds were fatal. To American analysts afterward, the battle off Sable Island became more than a tactical victory. It was a moment of transformation. The U.S. Navy had turned the tide of night fighting. No longer would darkness favor the fleet with better training, it would favor the fleet with better electronics. In one night, a decade of Japanese doctrine collapsed under a storm of radar-guided steel. But the implications ran deeper. What sank with Kirishima was not only a battleship, but an entire worldview. The belief that human senses could remain supreme in industrial war. The Americans had built machines that could see when men could not, calculate when men were too slow, and decide before men could think. For the first time, the human eye was no longer the measure of combat. That change would echo far beyond Guadalcanal. When daylight came, the ocean was quiet again. Oil burned on the surface where Kirishima had been. The crew of Washington walked her decks, staring at the distant glow on the horizon. They had won the battle without ever truly seeing their enemy. Some felt triumph, others unease. They understood that something profound had shifted, that they had crossed a threshold into a war ruled not by courage alone, but by computation. The battle off Guadalcanal ended in less than 10 minutes, but its consequences reshaped naval warfare for decades. When Kirishima slipped beneath the waves, she carried with her the last illusion that human eyes alone could rule the sea. The victory of USS Washington was not just a triumph of Gunryaka, it was the birth of the electronic battlefield. In the months that followed, American officers and engineers studied the engagement in minute detail. Every radar sweep, every firing correction was examined, diagrammed, and standardized. The result was a new command structure built around what became known as the Combat Information Center, or CIC. Inside these windowless rooms, radar screens, radio intercepts, and plotting tables merged into a single picture of the battle. For the first time, a warship possessed what modern strategists would call situational awareness. Decisions that once relied on scattered reports from lookouts could now be made in real time, guided by a complete understanding of friend and foe alike. The CIC transformed the ship into a thinking organism, where data flowed faster than human sight ever could. Japan, by contrast, could not keep pace. Her scientists had already built radar prototypes, and by 1943, some warships carried early sets for air warning. But these systems were rarely integrated with weapons. They operated as isolated instruments, useful for detecting an enemy, but useless for directing a gun. The Imperial Japanese Navy remained trapped by its own perfectionism. A new device had to meet exacting standards before it could be deployed, and factories were already straining to replace the losses of 1942. The result was fatal delay. While American laboratories built and fielded improved radar models every few months, Mark 8, Mark 12, Mark 22, Japan was still struggling to make its first-generation systems reliable at sea. The Americans were not chasing perfection, they were chasing advantage. The MIT Radiation Laboratory operated on a principle almost alien to Japanese industry. Deploy now, refine later. Engineers and sailors formed a continuous feedback loop. Combat crews sent reports from the front. Within weeks, laboratories produced upgraded components. Manufacturing partners such as Westinghouse, RCA, General Electricon built the parts by the thousands. By mid-1943, radar and fire control had become as standard aboard American ships as guns or engines. Every vessel from battleship to destroyer carried at least one radar set for surface detection, another for gunnery, and one for aircraft warning. All were connected through the CIC, the ship's electronic brain. This integration went beyond technology, it was cultural. American commanders began to plan battles, assuming perfect knowledge of the enemy's movements. Night operations, once considered suicidal, became routine. The Pacific no longer slept. Destroyers hunted supply convoys in darkness. Cruisers intercepted enemy task forces guided only by radar tracks. The ocean itself had turned transparent. The Japanese response remained rooted in the traditions that had once served them well. They continued to train lookouts to read silhouettes, continued to rely on optical fire control, continued to value the sharpness of human perception over the hum of machines. Even when reports filtered in describing American ships firing accurately without illumination, many officers refused to believe it. To them, radar was still an unproven novelty. Doctrine insisted that technology could not replace discipline. They learned otherwise in battle after battle. By 1943 and 1944, the technological gap had widened into a chasm. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American carriers used radar to detect incoming Japanese strike waves while they were still forming up over their own ships. Fighter directors aboard carriers watched glowing traces on screens, vectoring F-6F Hellcats to intercept long before the attackers could reach firing range. The Japanese never had a chance. Out of hundreds of aircraft launched that day, most were destroyed before they saw an American ship. To the survivors, it seemed the enemy could see through the clouds themselves. They were right. The same pattern repeated at the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura led his force of 2 battleships and 4 destroyers into the narrow channel under cover of darkness. He expected the advantage of surprise. Instead, radar-equipped American ships tracked his every movement for hours. When Nishimura's column entered the trap, 6 American battleships opened fire in unison. Each salvo was guided by radar, each correction computed automatically. The engagement lasted barely half an hour. Nishimura's force ceased to exist. The Americans called it a crossing of the T, but it was more like an execution by machine. Technology had not just changed tactics, it had rewritten the psychology of command. Where Japanese captains once trusted instinct and eyesight, American officers now trusted data. Where the Imperial Navy sought mastery through training, the U.S. Navy achieved it through integration. Even the tempo of battle had changed. Radar removed uncertainty, and uncertainty was what once slowed decisions. Now, a commander could act with absolute confidence, knowing the unseen world was mapped in glowing lines before him. The proximity fuse, or VT fuse, deepened this transformation. Developed at the Applied Physics Laboratory under the National Defense Research Committee, it used a tiny radar transmitter inside an artillery shell. When the shell approached an aircraft, it detected the target's reflection and detonated automatically. The effect was devastating. A single cruiser armed with VT fuzz shells could create a barrier of air bursts through which no aircraft could safely pass. To Japanese pilots, it seemed that American gunners possessed supernatural accuracy. In reality, it was simply another triumph of physics and mass production. Each fuse had to survive the shock of 20,000 times the force of gravity when fired, operate for only a few seconds, and detonate within yards of a fast-moving target, all while costing less than a dinner plate. American industry built them by the millions. Together, radar fire control, the CIC, and the proximity fuse formed the foundation of what would later be called networked warfare GOS, a web of sensors, weapons, and decision systems acting faster than any opponent could react. By late 1944, Japanese fleets fought not against men, but against a machine network that saw farther, fought faster, and struck harder. Every advantage that Japan had built before the war reached training, courage, seamanship was rendered obsolete by an invisible wall of technology. The tragedy is that the Japanese sailors never fought less bravely. On every ship, they performed their duties with the same discipline that had carried them through the early victories of 1942. But courage could no longer close the distance between the eye and the machine. When USS Washington destroyed Kirishima, the outcome had not been in doubt. It had been predetermined by years of scientific investment, industrial organization, and a philosophy that valued progress over perfection. The Americans had not just improved their weapons, they had redefined warfare itself. In the aftermath of Guadalcanal, the United States Navy did more than celebrate victory. It dissected it. For every admiral and engineer involved, the USS Washington's triumph over Kirishima symbolized something larger than a tactical success. It was the validation of a national philosophy that science, organization, and industrial discipline could overcome any opponent, no matter how skilled. From that moment on, America would never again separate warfare from technology. To American planners, the lesson was clear. Future wars would be won, not by those who trained the hardest, but by those who could adapt the fastest. The United States had turned laboratories into arsenals and scientists into soldiers. The MIT Radiation Laboratory, born in the urgency of 1940, became a model for what military research could achieve when bureaucracy was stripped away. Its open competition between teams, rapid prototyping, and instant communication with the fleet were revolutionary. When one engineer found a better circuit or a clearer signal, every radar set in the Pacific benefited within weeks. The pace of innovation itself had become a weapon. The American approach reflected a broader cultural instinct, a belief that no system was ever finished, no device ever perfect. Each radar, from the Mark 8 to the Mark 12 and Mark 22, was a stepping stone towards something better. Even when a design worked well enough, engineers demanded more range, more precision, faster integration with the Mark 1A computer and the ship's Combat Information Center, CIC. This relentless iteration produced an acceleration effect. Every improvement fed into manufacturing, which in turn made the next upgrade easier to deploy. By 1944, American naval doctrine assumed radar coverage so comprehensive that night and weather had ceased to exist as tactical barriers. Japan, on the other hand, entered a long period of disbelief. The Imperial Japanese Navy, so recently supreme, struggled to explain its defeats. Intelligence officers collected reports describing American fire opening at impossible ranges and with uncanny accuracy. Some suspected new optical systems. Others whispered of supernatural luck. Only a few officers, like Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omi, a staff analyst in the 8th Fleet, recognized the truth. His reports, submitted in early 1943, concluded that American radar and fire control technology were at least 2 years ahead of Japan's. By mid-1943, the gap had grown to 3. His analysis was dismissed at first as defeatist. The idea that a decadent industrial society could surpass Japan's disciplined warriors was almost unthinkable. Yet the evidence kept mounting until denial was no longer possible. After the war, men like Omi and Lieutenant General Masatake Okumiya, a former carrier commander, reflected bitterly on what had gone wrong. They understood that Japan's failure was not one of courage, but of system. A brilliant scientist in Tokyo could design a fine radar component, but there was no network to mass produce it, standardize it, and deliver it to the fleet. Research remained fragmented, factories under-resourced, and the military leadership bound by perfectionism. Okumiya wrote that Japan had fought with the skill of 1941 against the technology of 1944. He called it a war lost not by men, but by machines. To the rest of the world, the implications were profound. Guadalcanal marked the beginning of an age in which information itself became a weapon. The Americans had proven that control of data detection, tracking, computation could outweigh even the fiercest fighting spirit. Naval power had evolved from fleets of ships into networks of sensors. This lesson would echo through every military development of the 20th century: guided missiles, digital computers, satellites, and eventually the doctrine known as network-centric warfare. The same logic that connected radar to guns in 1942 would one day connect drones to satellites and algorithms to human commanders. For American society, the war also cemented a bond between science and state. Universities that had once pursued pure research now saw themselves as instruments of national security. The engineers who had built the Mark 8 radar and the proximity fuse would go on to create the first computers and the early architecture of the Cold War's technological race. The lesson of Guadalcanal was written into America's DNA: never allow an adversary to control the next frontier of innovation. Yet even amid triumph, there was introspection. Some officers worried that warfare had lost its human dimension. They remembered the night battle where Kirishima died without ever seeing her killer and wondered if the same fate might one day await them. If the machine could decide faster and shoot straighter, what role remained for courage? The question lingered in naval circles long after the war. But for most, the conclusion was inescapable. Technology had not diminished valor, it had simply changed its form. To trust a radar in the darkness, to fight by invisible data, required its own kind of couraging, the courage to believe in the unseen. Across the Pacific, the wrecks of Kirishima, Yamato, and Musashi would rest as monuments to a vanished era when power was measured in armor and caliber. Above them, a new kind of fleet sailed, guided by electrons, protected by circuits, commanded through information. And in every hum of radar and flicker of a screen lived the ghost of that night off Guadalcanal, when the balance of the world's oceans shifted forever. When the guns fell silent off Guadalcanal, the sea glowed with burning oil and fragments of a vanished world. To the survivors in the water, the distinction between victor and victim was meaningless. Both sides had fought with courage, both had done their duty. Yet the balance of history had shifted forever. The USS Washington had not merely sunk a battleship, it had buried an age. The story of Kirishima's last battle endures because it was more than a clash of steel. It was a collision between two philosophies of war. The Japanese believed mastery came from discipline and perfection. The Americans believed victory came from adaptation and speed. In 7 minutes of radar-guided fire, Those competing visions met in darkness, and the future revealed itself. Courage and tradition could not save a fleet that refused to evolve. By the end of World War II, the lesson was unmistakable. Technology had become the truest measure of power. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once a model of precision and professionalism, found itself outpaced by a system that rewarded experimentation over hierarchy and collaboration over pride. America's war machine had transformed scientific insight into industrial reality with unmatched efficiency. Factories, laboratories, and shipyards operated as one organism. Every discovery station, from the Mark 8 radar to the proximity fuzes station, fed directly into the field, accelerating the tempo of progress until no rival could keep up. But every revolution comes at a human cost. When Kirishima rolled beneath the waves that night, over 200 men went with her. They were not cowards or fools. They were sailors doing what they had been trained to do, to fighting by the light of their eyes in a war that had already moved beyond vision. Their defeat was not personal. It was historical. They fought the last battle of one era and died in the first battle of another. For the Americans aboard USS Washington, the victory was exhilarating yet unsettling. Many had never seen the enemy they destroyed. They had fired blind, guided by data instead of instinct, trusting machines whose hum replaced the heartbeat of combat. When daylight came and the wreckage of Kirishima was gone, some wondered whether war had changed too much schwa, whether machines had made it too clean, too distant. Yet they knew that survival depended on embracing that change. In war, the side that hesitates to evolve is already lost. After 1945, the echoes of that night reached far beyond the Pacific. The logic of radar became the logic of the modern world: integrate, automate, accelerate. Computers replaced analog machines. Networks replaced isolated systems. From guided missiles to satellite command, the same idea persisted: that information is the decisive weapon. The electronic fire control loop of 1942 was the ancestor of every digital battlefield to come. Historians often describe Guadalcanal as the turning point of the Pacific War. It was more than that. It was the moment when humanity crossed an invisible boundary. From that night onward, war would no longer be fought solely by what men could see or hear, but by what their machines could sense and compute. The courage of sailors would still matter, but so would the courage of engineers, scientists, and the quiet minds who built the tools of victory. Their laboratories became the new front lines. In the decades that followed, Japan and the United States both learned from that transformation. Japan rebuilt itself not as a martial power, but as a technological one, mastering the very sciences that had once defeated it. America, meanwhile, carried forward the philosophy born in radar-lit waters: constant innovation as national defense. Every new conflict, from Korea to the Persian Gulf, carried echoes of Guadalcanal, where electrons first outshone gunpowder. And yet, amid all the progress, the image that endures is a simple one: a battleship alone in the dark, its crew staring into nothing, unaware that the enemy already sees them perfectly. That is the eternal lesson of Kirishima's end. Technology does not merely enhance war effort, it defines who wins, who survives, and who disappears without ever understanding why. The sea still holds their story, silent and cold, a reminder that bravery without knowledge is tragedy, and knowledge without wisdom is peril. As the Pacific winds whisper over the wrecks of Sable Island, they carry a message written in steel and smoke: the future always arrives in silence. It does not announce itself with trumpets or banners. It comes as a flicker on a radar screen, a whisper in the static, a signal too faint to notice until it is too late. November 15, 1942 was the night that future began, and in that 7-minute storm of radar-guided fire, the modern world was born.